Okay, so we talked about blood in the body. Hopefully you guys watched that lecture. I'm sorry I had to miss that one. That would have been a good one to have in person. So if you ever have questions more on blood, come see me in my office hours. But now we're going to talk about how blood gets transported throughout the body, through your heart, and then next week we'll talk about all your blood vessels. So your heart is a muscular organ. It's essential to life because it will pump blood throughout the body. And blood is important because it carries oxygen. So if your heart stops functioning, no other tissue, cell in your body gets the oxygen it needs. And without oxygen, you can't create energy or ATP. So the heart is incredibly important. It's a member of the cardiovascular system. The heart of a healthy adult at rest pumps about 5 liters of blood per minute. And for most people, the heart continues to pump at approximately that rate for more than 75 years. So here's a look at the cardiovascular system with the heart in the center, just kind of left, direct, a little bit to the left of the sternum. And you can see all of the blue blood vessels are your veins and all the red blood vessels are your arteries. And we'll talk more about blood vessels next time. The heart is actually 2 pumps in one. So that's kind of the best way I like to describe the heart is it's 2 side-by-side pumps, with the heart's right side pumping to the lungs and back to the left side of the heart through vessels of the pulmonary circulation. And the left side of the heart pumps blood to all other tissues of the body and back to the right side of the heart through vessels of the systemic circulation. So when we talk about pulmonary and systemic circulation, the pulmonary circulation has to do with all the blood going to and from the lungs to pick up oxygen and to offload carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of all of your cells. And then the systemic circulation describes all of the blood vessels that exit out of the left side of the heart, travel to all the tissue capillaries, cells, and then return to the right side of the heart. So that's systemic circulation. And you can see here kind of the directions that CO2 and O2 go. The tissue capillaries will pick up carbon dioxide as waste and offload oxygen. And then in your lung, you take in oxygen into your blood and you'll offload the carbon dioxide into the air you breathe. And that's what you're exhaling, CO2. Here are the functions of the heart. It generates blood pressure. So your heart can beat or contract faster. It will route blood. So the heart is kind of the center of this circulatory system highway. It ensures one-way blood flow. So there's 4 very special valves in your heart that allow blood to only flow in one direction. And it also regulates blood supply by pumping more, slowing down, speeding up. It's about the size of a fist and weighs less than a pound. It's located between your lungs in the thoracic cavity, and the apex, the pointy side of it, points downward toward the left side of the body. You can see where the heart is located there in the thoracic cavity. The pericardia, these are just the walls that surround the heart. The pericardium is the double-layered sac that anchors and protects the heart within the body. The parietal pericardium is a membrane around the heart's cavity, and a visceral pericardium is a membrane on the heart's surface. And the pericardial cavity is the space between those 2 layers, and it's the space around the heart. And that is kind of the layers that surround the heart. The heart external anatomy. I'm so sorry if you can hear this baby I have with me. The coronary sulcus extends around the heart, separating the atria from the ventricles. 2 grooves or sulci for plural, which indicate the division between the right and left ventricles, extend inferiorly from the coronary sulcus. And the anterior interventricular sulcus will extend inferiorly from the coronary sulcus on the anterior surface of the heart. So the sulci will just, once we get to a picture, this will make more sense. You have a posterior interventricular sulcus. So again, a sulcus is a depression between the walls of the ventricles on the back. You have a superior and inferior vena cava, which will carry blood from the body to your right atrium. And you have 4 pulmonary veins that carry blood from the lungs to the left atrium. You have 2 arteries, often called the great vessels or great arteries will carry blood away from the ventricles, either to the lungs or the rest of the body. The pulmonary trunk itself will arise from the right ventricle, and it will split into the right and left pulmonary arteries, which carry blood to the lungs. And the aorta arises from the left ventricle, and that carries blood to the rest of the body. So let's take a look at some of this surface anatomy. And we'll look at what the inside of the heart looks like too, but your heart is made up of 4 chambers. The atria are the chambers on the top, and the ventricles are the chambers on the bottom. And the superior and inferior vena cava both empty into the right atrium. So the right atrium is where all the blood goes to first from the body. Here you can see your sulcus, or sulci for plural. A sulcus, again, is any sort of like depression that separates out some of these chambers on the external anatomy of the heart. So we have our superior and inferior vena cava. They're blue because they'll carry deoxygenated blood back into the right atrium. The aorta is in red. This is the other one of the great vessels. The aorta contains oxygenated blood, and that aorta will carry oxygenated blood from the left ventricle to all the body tissues. Then we have the pulmonary trunk in blue, and the pulmonary trunk will leave out of the right ventricle, and it will take all the deoxygenated blood to the lungs. So you'll see here the pulmonary trunk will split into pulmonary arteries, and that takes blood to the lungs. You'll notice here that most all arteries are red and most all veins are blue, but the only time that we see blue or deoxygenated blood in arteries will be the pulmonary trunk arteries that are going to the lungs because they haven't picked up oxygen yet. And this will make more sense when we look at the inside of the heart as well. The apex is kind of where my cursor is. It's this kind of bottom point at the bottom there. So if we look at the back side of the heart, so here's your posterior surface. You can see where some of these great vessels lie when we look at the posterior side. You can also see here how the left atrium contains left pulmonary veins and right pulmonary veins. These are again in red because even though they're called veins, they're carrying oxygenated blood from the lungs back into the heart now. That's what I was going to say. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart, and veins will always carry blood to the heart. Okay. So here are the chambers of the heart. So you have 4 of them, and they're all labeled anatomically. So they'll be right and left on the person themselves. The left atrium and right atrium are the upper chambers. The left ventricle and the right ventricle are the lower chambers of the heart. And again, they'll be rights and lefts anatomically. And then the coronary sulcus separates the atria from the ventricles. So here are the atria. They're small, they're thinner walled, they're holding chambers. So they hold blood that's come back from the great vessels before they contract and put the blood into the ventricles. They'll contract minimally then to push blood into the ventricles, which lie right below them. And the interatrial septum is a wall of tissue or muscle that separates the right from the left atria. Your ventricles then are inferior chambers. These are what we call the pumping chambers. They have thick, stronger walls because they're doing the pumping to your lungs or to the rest of your body. They'll contract much more forcefully than your atria will to propel blood out of the heart. And the interventricular septum is a wall of heart muscle that separates the right and left ventricles. And then we'll get to our atrioventricular heart valves first. So these are valves. They're made of tissue. They'll open and close to control when blood flows from the atria into your ventricles. The tricuspid valve has 3 cusps, and this is the atrioventricular valve between the right atria and the right ventricle. And the bicuspid valve, also called the mitral valve, is the AV valve between your left atria and your left ventricle, and that has 2 cusps. So your valves are controlled because they Each ventricle contains these cone-shaped muscles called papillary muscles. And attached to these papillary muscles, they are on the walls of the ventricles. They have these connective tissue strings called chordae tendineae, which attach your papillary muscles to the cusps of your atrioventricular valves. And when the ventricles contract, your papillary muscles will contract and prevent the valves from opening into the atria by pulling on the chordae tendineae strings. Then you have two more valves. We call these the semilunar heart valves, and these are valves between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. The pulmonary valve is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and the aortic valve is between the left ventricle and the aorta. So these are your semilunar heart valves. And this is a great picture detailing the internal anatomy of the heart. You can see the four chambers. Again, right atria, right ventricle are on the person's right side of the body, not how you're looking at it right now, but how it would lie in a person. And the left atria and left ventricle are on the left side. And then you can see also labeled here the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve. And then the semilunar valves, again, are at the openings to the great vessels. The pulmonary semilunar valve is the opening to the pulmonary trunk, and the aortic semilunar valve is an opening to the aorta. You can also see here the papillary muscles are kind of these cone-shaped muscles that are attached to the chordae tendineae. And again, that controls the opening and closing of those atrioventricular valves. Any questions on this so far? Have any of you guys had any heart anatomy?
Yes.
You have? Great, okay.
So I got blown up in Iraq, so I had to get MRIs and X-rays and ultrasound. So the heart is the hardest ultrasound study-wise or field to go into because it has like the more like it's just a full moving object, you know. And then each ventricle sounds different when you're looking at it or listening to it in this case. But yeah, it was so complicated. Like when the lady was doing the ultrasound on my heart, I was like asking questions, and I remember everything was different. Each ventricle and everything, it was just sounded different. But to me, it sounded the same. But to her, it was like, no, it's different. Like you can hear it.
Yeah.
So it was very, very interesting. And then on the X-ray wise, sometimes your heart can come out like enlarged. So yeah, it might freak you out for a while.
Okay. I'm glad you're okay. When you said you got blown up, that's not...
Yeah, well, they had to make sure that I wasn't bleeding internally and stuff like that. And I flew a couple meters, so.
Okay. Anyone else? Anatomy of the heart, have you guys learned any of this before? Or is this, if it's all new, or just put in the chat, if it's all new, put like a 1, or if you've had it before, 10, my scale of 1 to 10. And I'll kind of keep talking here. Your heart valves, this is a look at what your heart valves look like in a cadaver heart. And it's kind of fun, again, to see what this looks like in real life and not just a kind of a drawing of it. Oh, great. So it's new for some people. That's good to know. Yeah, we'll talk a little more. So here's a look at the valves and how they'll open and close to allow blood to pass through them. Again, these valves are really important because if they don't close all the way, blood could go back up or back into a chamber that it shouldn't, because we always want our blood to flow in one direction just to help with the efficiency of the delivery of oxygen. But if blood goes back up the way it came, or the valve isn't closing all the way, we call that a heart murmur. And you can usually hear that in from a stethoscope. So that's why the doctor listens to your heart kind of just with his stethoscope right away. He's listening to make sure that the valves are functioning correct and opening and closing the way they should. The cardiac skeleton is also called this fibrous skeleton. It consists of fibrous rings that surround these valves to give them solid support. And this connective tissue plate also serves as an electrical insulation between the atria and the ventricles in order for that so that the electrical signal can pass. So this is a look at the cardiac or fibrous skeleton. It has these kind of circular rings of tissue that allows the heart to contract as a unit, but also to allow electrical activity to pass through the heart the way it should. Okay, this is just a great slide detailing the blood flow through the heart. And I'll let you guys take a couple seconds to kind of look through this. I would encourage you guys, and we'll probably go over this in the lab next week, but to understand how blood flows through the heart and to use this slide as a guide, but also this slide kind of explains the same thing, and it will show you where the deoxygenated blood is, as well as the oxygenated blood comes in. And you can see all the steps and how blood goes into the right atria first. Then blood travels to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood will flow through the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Blood in the lungs will pick up oxygen and return back to the left atria via the pulmonary veins. And blood is now oxygenated, will flow into the left ventricle. And from the left ventricle, blood will be pumped out through the aorta. And the aorta and branches off the aorta will form all of your arteries that bring blood filled with oxygen to all the tissues of the body. Blood supply to the heart. So the heart itself needs oxygen to contract because it is a muscle. So your heart needs blood supply as well. So coronary arteries supply blood to the heart wall. They'll originate from the base of the aorta. The left coronary artery has 3 branches and it supplies blood to the anterior heart wall and left ventricle. Your right coronary artery is on the right side of the aorta. And then you have cardiac veins, which will drain all the blood that's deoxygenated from the cardiac muscle. And most will drain the blood into the coronary sinus, and the coronary sinus will drain into the right atria. So this just shows you the different coronary arteries on the heart and the different coronary veins that will drain blood from the heart and then send it back into the right atrium. This left anterior artery, or the left anterior interventricular artery, sometimes called the left LAD artery, is often the site of blockage. So if you have some sort of blockage due to atherosclerosis buildup in an artery and a coronary artery is blocked, that part of the heart cannot get blood supply and oxygen to it, and it will kill off the cells around it. And the cells that die off is what we call a heart attack or a myocardial infarction, when an area of the heart dies or is killed off because it's not getting oxygen due to some sort of blocked artery. And then you can put a stent in. A stent is like a little mesh, metal mesh that tries to go into the artery through the block and enlarge the artery so the blood can pass through it still. A bypass surgery tries to take an artery and graft it around the blockage. So if you hear of someone having triple bypass open heart surgery, there's 3 instances that they're trying to bypass a blockage in some of these coronary arteries. Here's the heart wall. You have the epicardium, the surface of the heart. The myocardium is the thickest muscular cardiac muscle layers. And then the endocardium is the smooth inner surface. Here's your cardiac muscle. It has a centrally located nucleus with branching cells. They're very rich in mitochondria. They're striated muscle with actin and myosin. Calcium and ATP are used for the contractions. And there are intercalated discs, which are just basically gap junctions that allow the electrical signal to pass through the cardiac muscle cells so your heart can contract as a unit. This describes cardiac muscle action potentials, and we'll talk a little bit about depolarization here, the plateau phase, and then repolarization and what channels are open and closed in order to create an action potential in these heart cells. And again, an action potential, or if we talk about your heart muscle cells becoming depolarized, that just means that they're being electrically fired or stimulated. So the depolarization phase, the sodium and calcium channels will open. The plateau phase, the sodium channels close and potassium channels start to open. Your calcium channels will also remain open. And then the repolarization phase, again, repolarization means everything goes back to resting. Your potassium channels remain open, the calcium channels will close. In the skeletal muscle, action potentials take 2 milliseconds. And in cardiac muscle, they take a little bit longer, about 200 to 500 milliseconds. So here's just a look at action potentials and comparing them in skeletal and cardiac muscle. If you remember, in the skeletal muscle, we just got like one action potential peak. And in cardiac muscle, we get kind of this longer plateau phase in the cardiac muscle cells. The conduction system of the heart is very coordinated. So the contraction of the atria and ventricles is very coordinated by specialized muscle cells that form this conduction system. And the conduction system of the heart includes the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, the atrioventricular bundle, the right and left bundle branches, and then the Purkinje fibers. So let me try to show you this picture first. So everything in yellow here is describing kind of this conduction system of the heart. And the conduction system means that the SA node, where everything starts, is known as the heart's pacemaker. So it's located in the right atria. This is where all of the action potentials will originate. It functions as the pacemaker. It has a large number of calcium channels. From the SA node, once that heartbeat or electrical stimulus is initiated, it will travel to the AV node, which is located in the lower portion of your right atrium. Action potentials from the SA node are sent to the AV node, and action potentials will spread slowly through it. And it spreads slowly, so that allows the atria to complete their contraction before the action potentials are delivered to the ventricles. So it's a very coordinated kind of way that this conduction system travels in order to make sure that the atria have enough time to contract and complete their contraction before the action potentials are delivered to ventricles. Then from the AV node, the conduction system, the electrical stimulus, spreads to the AV bundle, and the AV bundle will branch into left and right bundle branches to go to each ventricle. And the Purkinje fibers are at the tips of the bundle branches. They'll pass into all of the cardiac muscle cells in the ventricular walls. And in here, action potentials are rapidly delivered to all cardiac muscle of the ventricles at the same time so that they'll contract as a unit. So again, this just describes the action potential pathway through the heart. You should be familiar with this. Again, our electrical impulses start in the SA node. They travel to the AV node and then down the bundle branches and then into the Purkinje fibers. An electrocardiogram, EKG, because the cardia is the letter K in German. So a German guy must have been given credit for this. But an ECG or EKG is a record of electrical events in the heart, and it's really helpful in diagnosing anything abnormal. It uses electrodes placed on the skin surface throughout the body, and the skin surface electrodes these electrodes can detect the electrical activity of the heart through the skin surface. And an ECG contains the P wave, the QRS complex, and the T wave. The P wave describes when the atria depolarize, so when the electrical stimulus passes through the atria. The QRS complex will signify when the ventricles depolarize, and the T wave is when the ventricles repolarize or go back to resting. So this is one cardiac cycle, so one ECG segment. Here's the P wave, which represents when your atria depolarize. So your atria will contract right after this P wave. And the QRS complex stands for the electrical impulse traveling through the ventricles. And then the T wave stands for when the ventricles repolarize or go back to normal. And this electrocardiogram ECG, this segment will be repeated as many times as however long the person is hooked up to the machine. And we're able to measure the time in between intervals. So we can measure the time between when your atria and ventricles depolarize. And if that's longer than normal, that might signify that there's a block in the AV node, meaning that that electrical stimulus isn't getting to the ventricles as quickly as it should. So that might show a P wave is further in front of the graph than it should be. So the ECG is really very important and helpful for diagnosing any sort of heart problem, Ventricular fibrillation would just show kind of waves up and down that would lead to cardiac arrest. Myocardial infarction, a heart attack, is usually seen when this ST segment is kind of plateaued and makes a line like that. So you can get certified to read ECGs all day long in a hospital and make pretty good money if you're interested in that. So the cardiac cycle describes all of the events that occur within a single heartbeat. The heart is a two-sided pump with the atria being primers for pumps and ventricles being the actual pumps. So your atria just get things ready for the ventricles to really pump all the blood out of the heart. So your heart chamber contractions, your cardiac muscle contractions will produce pressure changes within the heart chambers, and these pressure changes will be responsible for blood movement. Blood will always move from an area of high to low pressure as it fills up the chamber that's empty. Atrial systole describes the contraction of the atria. Ventricular systole describes the contraction of the ventricles. Atrial diastole describes relaxation of the atria, and ventricular diastole describes relaxation of the ventricles. So here's a look at the cardiac cycle, just showing how the atria and ventricles will contract kind of in this normal sinus rhythm over and over again. And this describes, it's really hard to see here, but phase number 1, the atria and ventricles are relaxed and the AV valves are open, so blood is flowing into the ventricles. The ventricles will fill to about 75% of their volume. The atria will then contract to complete the filling of the ventricles in phase 2. In phase 3, the contraction of the ventricles will cause pressure in the ventricles to increase, so the AV valves will close. And when the AV valve slams shut, that produces the first heart sound that the doctor listens for in the stethoscope. He listens for the lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub sound. And that first heart sound is the closing of your AV valves. Then the continued ventricular contraction causes pressure in the ventricles to exceed the pressure in the pulmonary semilunar valves, or the pulmonary trunk and atria. So we have our semilunar valves being forced open and blood will be ejected into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. And at the beginning of ventricular diastole, the ventricles will relax and the semilunar valves will close. And the slamming shut of the semilunar valves is the second heart sound you hear. So we get this lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub sound. Each lub-dub, the first and second sound, is characteristic of one cardiac cycle. Here are all the events of the cardiac cycle kind of all lined up with how they would all appear. And this is kind of a confusing graph, but it's actually really interesting too, because you can see everything tied together. So if we just focus here on the first heart sound, then you follow up from the first heart sound. And again, the first heart sound is when your AV valves will close. So right before your ventricles will contract and eject all the blood. The left ventricular volume will be at its highest because it's about to eject all that blood, and the pressure will be at the lowest. This is also showing the ECG at the top. So the top shows the ECG graph, and remember the QRS complex, this big wave, was the depolarization of the ventricles. So when your ventricles depolarize, that will be right before they contract because the electrical signal got to them, and then they'll be able to contract as a unit. So again, these are just the events of the cardiac cycle, and it's kind of fun. Take some time looking at this to see how everything is tied together. So here are the heart sounds that I kind of talked about before. They make the lub-dub sounds. They're due to the closure of your AV valves and due to the closure of the semilunar valves. And here's a location of where these heart valves are located in relation to the heart. And also where these kind of pink circles are, or where a doctor would place his stethoscope to hear for the appropriate closure of those valves. Let's see here. Regulation of heart function. The stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped per ventricle per contraction. and this is about 70 milliliters per beat. The heart rate is the number of beats in 1 minute. So average heart rate is anywhere, they say like 60 to 80, really 60 to 100, but around 70 to 80 is normal. So you guys can take your own heart rate by feeling your pulse and how many times you feel that pulsing either on your wrist or in your neck. You can also feel someone's pulse in their ankle. So just take it for 15 seconds and multiply by 4 to get your heart rate. Anything less than 60 is called bradycardia, and anything greater than 100 is tachycardia, a high heart rate.
So AHA has the heart rate from anywhere from 80 to 100 is like standard for what we do, at least in the field.
Okay, 80 to 100. Okay, that's good to know. And so anything, so that's standard, 80 to 100. So even like 72 is a little bit low. And you're an EMT, Tristan?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds right. Cardiac output is the volume of blood pumped by the ventricle in 1 minute. This is about 5 liters per minute, which is a lot of blood if you think about it. To find or calculate out cardiac output, you can just take the stroke volume multiplied by the heart rate. And you're able to see and figure out what the stroke volume is, or the volume of blood being ejected, because of imaging that we can use to assess the heart. And then they can measure the heart itself when they see an image of it to calculate the volume of these chambers.
Yeah, I got a question that I never really asked. So like for us and like people in very good shape, their heart rate, like their resting rate is under 60. How can they determine medically wise? Like, I mean, all they can say is like, okay, you're in very good shape, but how can they like hint, something actually wrong?
Good question. So how would we be able to tell? So that's usually your doctor might ask you that. I remember when I played soccer in college, and I remember my heart rates would always be very low, and my doctor would ask me if I was an athlete, or I was, well, back then I was in shape, probably not anymore, but so I think your doctor might ask you those questions, or at least mine have in the past, because your heart is just like a muscle, and if you work it out and exercise and eat right, it'll be able to function and do the same thing that someone who doesn't work out, their heart would have to work a lot harder to do the same amount of output. So I would say if your heart rate is extremely low, the doctor would probably ask you questions about your lifestyle before, putting you on medication or diagnosing something's wrong. If it gets extremely low, it's bad for everyone, no matter how in good of shape you are, because if your heart isn't pumping enough, you won't get oxygen to your tissues, and you'll just, your tissues will just die without oxygen.
Thank you. Yeah. I was always wondering that, like, I mean, they always ask that question, they want that medical background, but I was always like wondering, like, how can they even figure it out?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Okay, so venous, so more intrinsic regulation, this will refer to all the mechanisms contained within the heart itself that control the cardiac output. So the venous return describes the amount of blood that returns to the heart via the veins. Preload, sleeping, your heart rate gets down. That's pretty low. Yeah, that is. The preload, this is the degree of the ventricular walls are stretched at the end of diastole. And these are all related to each other. So a little bit more, Starling's law of the heart is the relationship between the preload and the stroke volume, the amount of blood that exits out of the heart. The volume will influence the cardiac output. So for example, exercise increases your venous return. So it increases how quickly your veins will take blood back to the heart. It'll increase the preload, how much blood will be in the ventricles, the stroke volume, and the cardiac output. The afterload is the pressure against which ventricles must pump the blood. Extrinsic regulation of the heart, this refers to mechanisms external to the heart, like nervous or chemical regulation that will assess heart function. The nervous system control occurs through your sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And both sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve fibers will innervate your SA node. Do you guys remember, does the sympathetic nervous system increase or decrease heart rate? Did we go over that in nervous system?
It decreases, correct?
The sympathetic will increase it.
Okay.
Thanks for answering, Tristan. And parasympathetic will decrease heart rate. The baroreceptor reflex, it's a mechanism of the nervous system that plays an important role in regulating heart function as well. You have baroreceptors that will monitor blood pressure in the aorta and in the carotid arteries, which go up through your neck to your brain. Changes in blood pressure will cause changes in the frequency of action potentials. Your medulla oblongata is involved with this as well. So here's the baroreceptor reflex. So baroreceptors will have to do with blood pressure. So anytime the homeostasis is disturbed or distressed, if blood pressure increases, it'll tell your heart the baroreceptors will get sent up to the medulla, and the SA node and cardiac muscle will decrease their activity to try to lower that blood pressure. If blood pressure decreases, it'll tell your heart muscle cells to increase their heart rate to try to increase blood pressure, to try to keep this homeostatic balance of blood pressure consistent or within the normal range of blood pressure. The chemoreceptor reflex involves chemical regulation of the heart. Chemicals can affect the heart rate and stroke volume. By epinephrine and norepinephrine, they are always released from the adrenal medulla, which is in the adrenal glands. Your adrenal glands sit on top of your kidneys. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are a part of the adrenaline response, so they will increase heart rate and stroke volume. Excitement, anxiety, anger can increase cardiac output. Depression can decrease your cardiac output. And the medulla oblongata, which again is an area of their brainstem, has chemoreceptors for changes in blood pH and carbon dioxide, and potassium ions, calcium ions, and sodium ions will also affect cardiac function, because these will be the 3 ions that will enter and leave cardiac muscle cells in all of those phases: depolarization, plateau, and repolarization. So here's a look at the chemoreceptor reflex in regards to blood pH and maintaining a normal blood pH. And this just shows what will happen if blood pH increases or if blood pH decreases, and what the receptors and the control centers will do in order to send out the appropriate effect to get that blood pH back into the normal homeostasis range. So here's just a summary of extrinsic regulation. And again, extrinsic regulation is talking about the baroreceptors, chemoreceptors, nervous system fibers, anything that's outside of the heart that will regulate it to try to maintain homeostasis of blood pressure, blood pH, the nervous system functions. So if you're in a fight or flight situation, your parasympathetic nerve fibers will increase stimulation to cause your heart to contract and beat faster. And right after eating a large meal, the sympathetic nerve fibers are part of the fight or flight response. After eating a large meal, the parasympathetic nerve fibers will help to slow down the heart rate for the rest and digest division. Okay, and this is a great picture showing where these baroreceptors are located in kind of the walls of the aorta and also the walls of the carotid artery. Okay, heart disease, coronary artery disease is due to a decreased blood supply to the heart, where the coronary arteries are narrowed for some reason. They're usually narrowed because there's atherosclerosis or plaque buildup. You get plaque buildup in your coronary arteries from lifestyle and eating habits. Myocardial infarction, MI, heart attack is due to a closure of one or more of those coronary arteries or a blockage within the coronary arteries. And that's because that area of the heart muscle, when it does not get the sufficient blood supply that it needs, it will die and it will scar. And that scar is what an infarct is called. So that's why we call the myocardial infarction. It's a scarring or death of myocardial tissue. Angioplasty is a procedure that opens blocked blood vessels. A stent is a structure, like a mesh metal-like structure that's inserted to keep the vessels open. And a bypass surgery is a procedure that reroutes blood away from the blocked arteries and just bypasses that blockage. And that's the end of the slideshow, so I'll stop the recording here.